Brian Lamb is the founder, executive chairman, and former chief executive office of C-SPAN. Born and raised in Lafayette, Indiana, he earned a degree from Purdue University before joining the United States Navy. After various jobs in the communication field, including a stint in the Pentagon Public Affairs Office during the Vietnam War, he founded the nonprofit channel in 1979. Lamb has conducted over 1,000 interviews in his lifetime, starting in high school and continuing on C-SPAN programs, including book notes and Q&A. He has compiled multiple books from his work on book notes, including book notes on American character.
I don't trust David for choosing this student to introduce me because she has the same name as my wife, Victoria, so making me feel at home right away. Thank you very much. I have to tell you, as Victoria said, I'm a graduate of Purdue University, and I have been involved in the last couple of years in setting up a Washington-based program. And I'd never thought that I would use the word envy, but seeing this place makes me very envious because we bring 20 students in May and we house them in one room over at C-SPAN where we do our interaction with people, and this place is just magnificent, and I'm sure you students know that. I want to make sure that we get a microphone over here. We do have it now because one of the things I like to do best is ask people questions instead of talking. Don't mind answering questions, and I'll be glad to. Hillsdale College and C-SPAN have one very important thing in common. We take no government money under any circumstances, anytime, anywhere, any place. And I supposedly founded the network, but really, I was completely accurate. There were about 22 people that founded C-SPAN. They were all business people. They owned cable television companies. They offered the money up in the very beginning in 1977 originally for the sole purpose of creating a public service. There is no government money involved in it whatsoever. And that's kind of one of the themes that I like to talk about with folks, and that is the whole experience of money, what impact it has on you, where it comes from. And one thing I like to say is that whatever you see on television, the first thing you ought to ask is, where do they get their money? That will tell you everything about why they're doing what they're doing. It doesn't mean that they're bad or good, depending on where their money comes from. It just means that it will tell you that if it's a commercial-driven network, they need eyeballs to sell to commercial advertisers, and if they don't get them, they're out of business. And that's one of the things that happened to Al Gore's network, Current. He could not get the eyeballs, although he founded a country that would spend $500 million on buying it back, so he was able to get a tremendous return on his money, which is unusual because people want access more than anything else. But that's been our secret. Everything we do is based on where our money comes from. It comes from all these different companies. No one company has control. We have a board of directors of 21, and we have a very important bylaw that says no board member can have anything to say about programming. And that was a creation of one of our board members, because I remember saying to him one day, you know, I haven't gotten much negative feedback from our industry about what we've covered, but it always makes me nervous that somebody's going to call me one day and say, if you don't cover this, or if you do cover this, we're going to cut off your money. And he said, well, I think the best thing to do is just put a new bylaw in that suggests that they can't have anything to say about it. So he did. And it's been a great story. I've always thought it was a similar story to the founding of the country. It's not that big a deal, but it was created by a group of people who had no real experience in news and information, but agreed to the concept and the mission. And we're here 34 years later, actually basically 36 years if you count the creation time and all that. So that's the background more than anything else that I wanted you to know is where the money comes from. Now, students. Who's got the microphone? I want to ask you all why you're here. Just that simple question, why are you here? Why do you go to Hillsdale? And why are you here in Washington? And anybody take me up on that offer and tell us who you are.
My name's Malika Willoughby, and I'm actually one of only 2 Hillsdale students on this row up here. The rest of us are interning. But I chose Hillsdale because of the respect that I saw between the professors and the students. And they wanted to be where they were, and they could all answer the question, what is a liberal arts education? And they knew what the mission of the school was.
What is a liberal arts education?
Well, from what I've come to know at school, it's studying the greats of who have gone before us so that we can stand on their shoulders. So studying the best minds that have applied themselves to philosophy, art, music, so that we can gain from them and continue learning in those capacities.
Good job. I'd like to ask somebody who's not going to Hillsdale but who is here to tell me why you're here. Don't be timid. Got to keep this moving. Somebody put your hand up. Thank you.
All right. My name's Jessica Cruzan. I go to school in Danville, Kentucky, and at Center College, it is a small liberal arts school as well. And I'm interning across the street at the Heritage Foundation. And do you want me to answer why I'm here?
Sure, but Center, you go to Center.
Center College, where the vice presidential debate was this past election.
And the election before, was it? That there've
Yes,
been 2 out there.
there have been 2 there.
I want to ask, I've never asked anybody from Center this, what is it in the water there that allows you to have 2 major debates on your campus?
We have a very resourceful and fantastic president that everybody really respects there.
So your president knows how to raise money? Yes. Yeah, okay. Money story number 1, see? So why are you here?
I'm here because being in DC, I think is a fantastic opportunity for me to just gain a lot of knowledge, as much knowledge as I can from a lot of great minds that hang out here.
So what is the number 1 thing you would tell your parents or your closest friend back home about Washington, D.C.? Not about this program, but about what you've learned about Washington.
You can't trust anyone, but you can learn from everyone, and also you have to always be dressed to impress because you never know who you're going to meet on these streets.
That's pretty darn good. I'm so sorry to hear you can't trust anyone. I've been in this town for 47 years, and I guess I'm naive. I still trust everyone in Washington. Who else has something you want to tell us? Come on, you folks look like you know something. Pass it right to your next door neighbor there. You didn't know you were going to have to work when you came here today. Tell us who you are.
My name's Courtney Murphy, and I go to Baylor University down in Texas. And I'm also interning across the street at the Heritage Foundation.
Do you know Ken Starr?
I do know Ken Starr. I've met him once.
What would you say about him?
He also knows how to get the money in.
He also knows now how to get basketball, baseball,
he knows how to get
basketball.
sports programs going
Yes.
too, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Do you play sports?
I don't. Intramurals, but that's about it.
So what about Washington? What have you learned about Washington that maybe surprised you? Pick anything.
I mean, I've learned a lot. I was here last summer as well, and I think just learning the whole how the government works, and how one thing that surprised me the most was how there's a bunch of 25-year-olds up here running the government. I thought that was probably the most interesting thing that I learned. So.
When I first came here, I was in the Navy, but at age 26, I was a press secretary for a senator, and I wouldn't say that we ran the office. I say a lot of 26-year-olds tried to run the office. He would remind us from time to time that he was the senator and he was elected, which a lot of them ought to do more often than they do. How about thank you. How about over here? Is there a microphone on this side? Pass it to Victoria there. I want to know a little bit more about her. Victoria, why did you come to Washington, and what have you found since you've been here?
I came to Washington because I was very inspired by the grassroots movement and all the work they've been doing, and I kind of wanted to see if there was a part that I could play. And since I've been here, I would agree, I was very surprised the average age of the staffers. I kind of thought they were all interns, and I learned they weren't. I've also just kind of been surprised at how small this town is and how interconnected everything is as well. That was definitely something I've learned.
If one of your good friends and where do you go to school?
I go to Hillsdale College.
And if one of your good friends was preparing to choose where she or he would go next, what would you tell them about Washington? Would you give them some advice that you would not expect to give them a couple years ago?
Well, if it's a girl, I would say bring flats, not heels. And but on a serious note, I would say just to be prepared to be prepared to take in all the information that's going to be coming at you. There's just so much going on in this town. It's very hard to kind of look at the big picture and not get caught up in the small details. So I would just say bring a notebook and just open your ears and open your eyes to everything.
Did I get the right? Is it Michaela? Is that the right? Yeah. Victoria, pass the microphone to her. I'll ask her a couple questions because she's been very quiet over there. If you want to get the news and you do some writing as it is now, tell us where you're interning.
I work at I'm an intern at the Leadership Institute, and I write for their campus newspaper called Campus Reform Online.
So if you were telling somebody, first tell us where you get most of your information.
A lot of our information comes from tips from students that we have gained connections with, and the rest of it is just personal research and learning where to look for news. And because a lot of what we try to do is to break news and not just to try and recycle old things and repackage it in a different manner.
What's your number one personal news source for national current events?
That I personally...
Where do you go in the morning to learn what's going on in the world?
I can't say that there's one. I obviously I look at Fox. I look at the Wall Street Journal. I look at the Spectator. There's a lot of different things that depends on the day.
Well, thank you. I was reflecting on my own situation when I came here in 1966. There are people in this audience I can tell, I wouldn't dare point you out, that probably are around my age. And in 1966, for instance, this wasn't here. The Heritage Foundation wasn't there. Fox News didn't exist, and we didn't exist. And I think one of the things I learned about myself was that I wasn't really ready to learn when I went to college. I think in some ways I should have taken a couple years and gone somewhere and done something else. I actually spent 4 years in the Navy, and if I'd have done that first, I might have been more serious about learning. David mentioned when he first was up here about Tocqueville. The interesting thing for me was I didn't have any idea who Tocqueville was. And I started interviewing people. I did a book show for 16 years called Book Notes. And I would sit down every week with an author, hardback, nonfiction, and I set it up so I would only interview them once. I would not go back to the same well all the time. So over a period of those 16 years, I did 801 separate interviews with 801 different authors. And along the way, I discovered this guy, Tocqueville, or as some people call him, believe it or not, Tocqueville. Tocqueville, de Tocqueville, de Tocqueville, de Tocqueville. It seems that everybody has a different way to pronounce his name. And I got so interested in it that working with our own group over there, I suggested that we go find out who he was. And so back in 1997 or 8, I can't remember the exact date, we decided to do a 55-city tour, going from Washington, D.C. and Rhode Island, where he first went to, all through 9 or 11 states. And in 55 communities, we took our big bus there and we did a program highlighting what happened there. And the reason I mention that is in the course of this, I found out one night when I was speaking in Springfield, Illinois, to the Abraham Lincoln Association. The guy comes up to me. I said, we're going to go follow Tocqueville around. This guy comes up after the dinner's over, and he said, you know, there's a chateau where Tocqueville used to live. And at that moment, it was the first time I'd ever heard that. And he said, it's over in France. It's actually in a small community called Tocqueville. And I got very excited. I mean, one of the great things about not doing what I should have done in college is that I had this incredible appetite to learn once I got beyond that and got into this town and started experiencing history. So I said to our group, we're going to Tocqueville. We're going to see if we can do a program over there. And we ended up doing a live show on a Saturday morning in the middle of the rain from Tocqueville, France, with the descendants. It's really kind of a stretch, but the great-great-grandniece's husband was he owned the chateau, you know, and he also had a son named Alexei, which helped us. And he had a dog named Gotha. Actually, I'll tell you a story about Gotha, which has nothing to do with anything. But we went, I mean, because it's one of the more embarrassing things that's ever happened to me. We all went out to lunch as we were surveying the place. And right after lunch, and you know, the French love garlic. And most of us love garlic. So I had something that had lots of garlic in it, and I decided to pop something that I shouldn't have done. I popped a piece of gum in my mouth. And I was quietly chewing as we came back to the chateau, and we had the Count with us. Count Duraville was his name, and the son, Alexei, and it was very exciting, and a bunch of C-SPAN people. And we're looking at a way to have a show over there. So I realized that chewing gum wasn't the most sophisticated thing to do, so I took a piece of gum out and just tossed it. The unfortunate thing was that the gum landed on the side of Gotha the dog, who was a black dog, and it was a white piece of gum. And I looked over and saw that and said, you know, if the Count sees this, I'm toast. I mean, you know, talk about unsophisticated. So I decided, as he's talking to people, to go over to try to get the gum off the side of the dog. So I reached down and pulled, I mean, first of all, it was a big dog, big black dog. I reached down kind of this way to pull it off, and what I realized was I pulled the gum off, but there was a long string of gum. And I'm thinking, I mean, this is a silly story, but I'm thinking, if I get caught, this is going to really be stupid. I did get away with getting the gum off, but it was one of those things where, you know, I couldn't quite get it off my hands. The good news was the Count didn't want to shake hands with me at any time, so I was pretty much home free. But the more important story, and the thing that has some tie to C-SPAN, and I always have felt, and this is a bit of a stretch, but the original C-SPAN was James Madison, because James Madison took all the notes at the Constitutional Convention, and I don't know that he got every word down. He certainly didn't, but that was the difference was in those days they hammered the windows shut in Philadelphia. So in a hot May to September, it must have been very painful in there to have to sit in there. But you didn't know until a long time after that exactly what was said. But James Madison, I think he was, I like to say he was only 5'2". And 100 pounds, was the guy that recorded all this. Then when I got more involved in the Tocqueville story, and those of you who have never thought about Tocqueville, I suspect all Hillsdale students have and been taught about Tocqueville, might remember that he came to this country in 1831. He was 25 years old, and he came with a buddy of his named Gustave Beaumont. De Beaumont, if you're a French speaker. In our vernacular, he'd be Gus Beaumont is who it would be, and Al Tocqueville. But the one thing that he did, and we had these made up when we did this series on Tocqueville, were these little booklets. And they're only 14 pages. I had these made up just to show off. And he had 14 of them that he filled with his chicken scratches about what he learned when he went around the United States. And so that's how he recorded the basics of what he ended up writing in Democracy in America. And when we got there, only thing I learned that in the garret of the chateau were all of these, they call them cahiers, and they were just little notebooks. And I just wanted to see one of them. And we got the Count to agree to take us up into the garret. But when we got up there, we learned that the Count was, and it was beautiful in this round room and all these boxes full of Tocqueville letters and everything. The Count was only willing to show us one document. And that was the first letter that Tocqueville ever wrote when he was 5 years old. And I had asked our producer, who was French, please ask. I just want to see one cahier. That's all I want to see. I want to see what it looks like. I won't hurt it. He can hold it. I don't need to hold it, although I would like to. And the Count refused, and she refused to ask him. And it was really kind of a French standoff between the French and the Americans over this one small little issue. So when we did our live program, we had a guest on who was the foremost expert on Tocqueville. Her name was Françoise Melonio, and she was a member of the Insider Group and was a friend of the families and all that. And she sat on the set with us, and she had a cahier. So I figured I was going to get around it somehow or another. And so in the middle of the program, I said to Françoise, would you mind if I looked at that up close? And she handed it to me, and that's how I got my hands on one cahier. It means nothing to anybody but me. But the reason I mentioned it again was the old-fashioned way of documenting what went on and compare that to what we're doing today. And I want to go back to the students because I want to ask them about today's way of cataloging all this information. How do you keep track of what's going on, and do you use Twitter, Facebook, instant messaging, email, all that stuff?
You want me to answer?
Yes.
Okay. I actually last night just wrote down that Twitter is a tool, as is Facebook. And so yes, I do use them, but I try to be purposeful in the way that I use them. I obviously use email. I read a lot of blogs. That's how I keep up with my news. And then there are certain websites that I'll go to as well.
Do you tout?
Do I count?
Tout.
Tout.
Does anybody know what touting is?
Is it like clouding?
No. Any of you students know what touting, if you tout? Huh? It's a similar thing to Twitter, but it's a 15-second video that people often send out, and they have to keep it to 15 seconds. How about somebody else telling us how you use all this new fandangled stuff and whether it's good or bad for us? Who has an opinion that hasn't spoken? Bring that mic down here. They're not going to, unless I point to them, they're just, there we go.
Thanks.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Meg Goodman. I'm from Southwest Baptist University in Missouri, and I'm interning at the Heritage Foundation. I'm kind of like Malika. I use Facebook and Twitter just to kind of keep up with what's going on. I read some blogs as well, some news sites. And I think a lot of it is just really condensed. Like, you get the surface level of all these things that are going on, but you really have to do the research on your own if you want to get anything that's substantive. So, I don't know, it's a good way to have like a general idea of what's going on, but you have to do the work on your own if you really want to know about a specific issue, I think.
What's your reaction to what's going on right now with the Snowden release of all the documents?
It's kind of scary. There's a lot in the news about it right now, so I kind of feel like it's all over the place, but I need to do some more research on it.
How do you feel about this whole idea that we can capture all this stuff, put it on servers, keep it forever? Is that good?
I mean, I think it's kind of terrifying. I'm an accounting major, so you want to keep track of things, but I don't think those things need to be kept track of, so I don't know.
We pass that to somebody else that hasn't talked here, but we have just passed a milestone at C-SPAN. We have 200,000 hours of C-SPAN video available to the public free of charge on our video library. And those of you who have never been there, you'd be bowled over by what is there. And you can get on by just going to c-span.org, and especially if you're a student, you can have a ball putting together a good presentation for your class. What is your name?
Hi, I'm Danielle DeBose, and I'm from the University of Alabama.
What do you don't have an accent, do you?
Probably not a big one.
Just a tiny little one. Well, what's your reaction to all this new? See, for us, this is new. For you, you've lived with it as you grew up.
I mean, it's overwhelming for us, too. Everyone says that the young people love all the social media, but it's a good thing, but it seems like too much information at times. So I think it's helpful to find what you believe is reliable news sources and turn to that and not have 1 million followers on Twitter.
Do you tweet?
I'm not a big tweeter of my own thoughts. I don't know how, I retweet a lot of things, but it's kind of hard to come up with a very clever thing to say on Twitter, so.
Thank you. Just a little background on C-SPAN if you've never paid any attention to it, then I'll open it up to any question you might have. We have 280 people that work at C-SPAN, and we're located right over on Capitol Hill, right here on Capitol Hill, but we're over there on North Capitol Street, about a block from the Senate. And we have 3 networks, C-SPAN 1, 2, and 3. Some parts of the country don't get 3. You can get all 3 on the internet at your desk if you want to watch it. We are a public service to the cable industry, as I said earlier, and they pay for it at a rate of about $3 million a year. We've been in business on the air since 1979. An awful lot of the people that work there are from this area. I'm trying to get as many people from Purdue as I can in there to straighten out the place, but we only have half dozen at most there. But it's a lot of folks that went to University of Maryland, University of Virginia, and around the district, George Washington and George Mason and all. And we have an internship for each season. Some of you who haven't thought about your internships for the future, be sure to keep us in mind, because it's an opportunity for you to get inside a place like ours, which is your ticket to the future. One of the hardest things about getting a job these days is just getting in. For every job that we have available, we get about 200 applicants, which is, most of them aren't qualified for it, but they're reaching out, as you know, to whatever source they can. Our mission is very simple, and that is to put our cameras in front of as many different political events as we can, including the House and the Senate and the hearings. We do about 2,000 hours of hearings every year. And to do it every day, all the time, so that as I grew up, if the networks were motivated, they would cover an event. If they weren't motivated, they wouldn't cover an event, and that was most of the time. Even though the news divisions might want to cover something, the people that collect the money and paid the bills would say, not on your life. And there are a lot of stories about news people that wanted to cover hearings, and they started out covering them, and then they all of a sudden said, no, we can't do this anymore, we're losing money on the deal. There's almost nothing that we do that hasn't been done before, but it's never been done in a concentrated way, which allows you to be guaranteed that you can see almost every hearing that goes on from start to finish. I will say this, in the last couple of years, very quietly, without anybody really knowing it, your friendly federal government, mostly the Senate and the House, has spent a lot of your money on doing the same thing we're doing, putting cameras in the hearing rooms, streaming it online. The White House has a major website that's incredibly successful. And that goes back to the old days that we've heard forever, that politicians want to speak directly to their constituents. They don't want to have to fool with the middle person. And, you know, in spite of the fact that I like the idea that they can have that option, that certainly would be a bad way to run a country. You need people in the middle of all that, no matter what you think of their politics, because, as you know, when they're spending our money, it might be a good idea for somebody else other than the government to look after it. We have 74 inspectors general in the government in this town. They matter a lot, but even with that, you can't be sure that you're going to get all the things going on that we should know about. Anyway, that's a little bit of a background. If anybody in the room has a question that they'd like to ask, I'll do the best I can to try to answer it. Silence. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I'd just like to thank you for coming and talking to us. And one thing I'd like to ask you to share with us is how 800 sounds like a lot, but it's not very many when you consider how many books are published. But so 800 is a small number. How do you decide which ones to do? I was recently watched your interview with Carol Barkalow, who wrote In the Men's House, and was very impressed with the questions that you ask. And I just wondered how you make a decision to do an interview with an author on a book.
Well, I'll give you an example of today. I just came from doing an interview with a fellow named George Packer, who writes for The New Yorker, and he has a book out called The Unwinding, which I'd looked at it and found it very interesting, but we had not decided for a lot of different reasons that we were going to do that interview, and we got a call yesterday saying he was in town, and at the last minute he agreed to come in at 10:15. I went home yesterday afternoon early and dived into this book, which I found very interesting, and he has done a number of things in the book that you might find interesting. He comes from the New Yorker, and immediately I'm sure you would think that is a particular political persuasion, but I found it difficult in this book to see any real strong bias about who he's reporting on. And he does vignettes on 10 different Americans that he wrote off of the books that they had written, and that's from Newt Gingrich to Oprah Winfrey. And he also highlights some areas of the country, Tampa, Silicon Valley, and he was born out there, and also the third part of Wall Street. Then he found 3 people that he followed for months and months. A fellow from North Carolina, one from Ohio near Youngstown, and the other one was a former aide to Joe Biden. And his premise is that we started unwinding, probably in Vietnam, then in Watergate, and then he takes us from about 1978, which is, we started in 1979, up till now. It wasn't a scientific decision. There wasn't an ideological reason for doing it. George Packer was an original supporter of the Iraq War. He wrote a book called Assassin's Gate, which was all about Iraq. He spent a lot of time over there. And it was a last-minute decision. Sometimes, however, there's a book that I'm reading that I'll do, I think it's next week, on John Hay, a brand new book on John Hay. And John Hay went all the way from being a secretary to Abraham Lincoln to being Secretary of State. He was secretary to Abraham Lincoln when he was in his early 20s. He might even have been as young as 19. I can't remember for sure. I haven't really gotten into the book yet. But that's a historical figure. So there's no rhyme or reason to this, except we always have our eye on the politics. If we get somebody from the left, we want to get somebody from the right. And it's not politically correct as a show, but I don't want people sitting out in the audience missing the point that it's worth listening to all different sides before you make up your mind. So there is no rhyme or reason to it. Now I will go back to somebody that we've done before if they were a particularly interesting person. I just like to learn. It's that simple. And I've learned a lot from those books. Thanks for the question. Anybody over here? Yeah. Yes, sir. It's a very quiet, respectful group.
I sort of wanted to ask you the question that you were asking a lot of my fellow interns. As someone who's arguably watched Washington and Congress more closely than anybody else in this city, what would you tell someone not from here that that they wouldn't really know from normal news media, something that would surprise them about Congress's actions?
I don't know. I think one of the reasons that I got involved in the C-SPAN thing in the beginning was I came from a small town in Indiana, Lafayette. And by the way, you'll find out how strange I am. I just got back from a week in Paris, and we went to Lafayette's grave. Looked all over. The one thing about it, this is a side story, is that when we got to Lafayette's grave, you had to really go out of your way to find it. It was behind a church, and you had to wait until 3 o'clock in the afternoon and all that stuff. And we found one other human being in the graveyard. When we went to the Jim Morrison grave in Père Lachaise, as I had done years earlier, I went to Père Lachaise, not just the Jim Morrison grave. It's just befuddling to me why 50 Americans are standing around there looking at his gravesite, because I never liked him anyway, and I never liked the Doors, and I never liked, I mean, I didn't know him, but I find it fascinating that people are falling all over themselves, and it's the only gravesite in the entire Père Lachaise cemetery that has Oscar Wilde and Marcel Proust and lots of other people in it that anybody stands around looking at the gravesites. It's a bizarre choice. I would say that you can kind of know now, no matter where you live in the United States, if you've paid attention, what this place is like. And that was one of the reasons that I got involved in this. Because when I got here and I looked around, I said, my close friends, and they're in Indianapolis, and I said, they don't know. I mean, the behind the scenes stuff. And so one of the things that we do that you may never have noticed is that, and this doesn't always happen, but should, at the end of every hearing that we cover, or every event, we stay 2 minutes beyond the end of the event and watch people react to the chairman and the members of the committee and the routine, because it's amazing what goes on. And if you're sitting in the room, you can see that. And that was one of the things that we started years ago so that people back there, outside of this area, could see that small dynamic. We're also the ones that started covering the dinners. I was befuddled when I got here about these dinners, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the Radio and Television Correspondents' Dinner. I thought it was a very odd thing that happened. You would go into this ballroom at the Washington Hilton. There'd be 3,000 seats there. You had a table and somebody from a news organization was inviting a source to sit there with you, and you'd yuck it up during the night and drink wine and hope that your source got drunk and would tell you things that you shouldn't know. And it was bizarre that there was this friendship thing that everybody tried to develop, because I guarantee you that the farther you get away from this place, the more accurate you can be on criticism and, you know, looking at what goes on here without having a personal relationship. And knowing people here are nice unless they are arrogant. And they're arrogant when they begin to get power and they surround themselves with security. That's the thing that I find absolutely astounding, is how many people in this town now have security. It becomes a badge of honor. I realize that this is an unsafe world we live in, but if you're an assistant secretary for UMPH and you've got a security person, it's a bit of a stretch, and there's an awful lot of that going on. It makes you feel important. You're always in a hurry. You're always protected. At that point, you have really no idea what the real life is like, and that's one of the first things you notice when you get up close and personal. I spent 2 years in the Senate over there. I would never go back. The reverence for a member of the Senate that back in those days was extraordinary, and as far as I was concerned, outsized. These are just human beings that went around collecting your money so that they could run and have a job. And we have overdone it up close and personal in this town, and as far as I'm concerned. I think that's the first thing I noticed, and that people would, the reverence, the senator this, the senator that, the senator wants this, the senator wants. I was 26 years old, as I say, when I was a press secretary, and I was appalled by it. I just said, this is nuts, you know, and I said, I got to get out of here. I don't want that. I don't want to do it any longer. And the White House, of course, is far worse than any place in the town. The Kool-Aid you drink at the beginning ensures that you will have a very, very prejudiced view of everything that goes on inside the White House. But there are lots of other things. I won't bore you with it. This gentleman here had a question. Yes, sir. You look very familiar, Ken. He was one of our scholars in our Tocqueville series. Good to see you again.
Yes,
I haven't seen you
in years. It was an extraordinary privilege to be invited with greats like Harvey Mansfield and others on that first Tocqueville program from Newport. I didn't own a television then, so I didn't know much about C-SPAN and so on. But I've evolved since then and become a Facebook addict and so on. But I wanted to ask you, well, given that this was your introduction to Tocqueville, what lesson from Tocqueville or lessons would you think would be most relevant for people serving in the government here?
Well, you know what? One of the big moments in the Tocqueville democracy in America is the quality of the membership in the Congress that he found when he was here. I won't go into that. I don't necessarily agree with all that, but I do agree with some of that. I took away from Tocqueville something that it's not terribly intellectual, and that is, it's amazing to me that a man 25 years old with his friend could come to this country, travel around, meet with a former president, you know, the John Quincy Adams he met with and others, and learn so much about us. And as you know, you know more than I do, he was here supposedly studying the prison system. We've been to all those prisons where he went, to Auburn and to Ossining and places like that. But it's just an amazing success story about, and you folks who are in your 20s end up possibly doing your most important work when you're 25 years old. I mean, he was, what, 30, 31 when he eventually published Democracy in America, the first volume. I was just blown away by how much he observed, and there's so much in there about community and religion and all the different groups in our society. So I'm not a scholar, but I've often heard people say that outside of the Federalist Papers, Democracy in America is the second most important book on politics ever written for this country. But you're the expert. That's why we ask you to talk to us. Yes, back in the back.
Henry. I'm a rising senior at Yale, and I'm also an intern at the Heritage Foundation. And we had a speaker recently come visit who made several conjectures about how C-SPAN has changed the way the Hill works. So I was wondering if you could speak on your opinion about how C-SPAN has affected the way senators and congressmen conduct their business.
That's a question that, since the beginning, people have wanted to know what I thought, and I don't have any deep thoughts on it. I try not to even think about it, because there are a lot of people that think it was a terribly bad idea to put television in the House and in the Senate. I will say this, the impact it's anecdotal. Ronald Reagan watched C-SPAN a lot, and I always thought this was interesting. You're president of the United States and you come into this town and you've won the election and you nominate people to be secretary of whatever. That's the last time you see them. They come up to the Hill, they testify. In the old days, the networks would use 30 seconds on the evening news, and you had no idea whatsoever what the give and take was. Now any president of the United States can watch all of his or her, eventually, cabinet members testify. And so that's small. We had an experience back in 1983, I think it was, and it was probably the single most mind-blowing event of my entire experience at C-SPAN. We had a group of kids. Ronald Reagan always wanted to do programs with young people, and he had done those when he was in California. He did them on cable systems out there, and he came to town here, and he had an aide that worked for him that was not immediately around him by the name of Joe Holmes. Some of you may have known him. Joe was an old California hand, and he'd often go to the ranch with Ronald Reagan, and he said to him one day, he said, "I'd like to do programs with young people again." And so Joe Holmes somehow or another got to us, and we went down and said, he said, "Were you interested?" And we said, "Absolutely." And so we got together with the Close-Up Foundation, and the Close-Up Foundation brings high school kids to town, and he agreed to do, it ended up 4 programs where he would come into a room like this, actually in the Eisenhower EOB, it's the room on the 4th floor, 450, I think it was. But he would just sit down immediately and say, "What are your questions?" And for a half an hour, young people, even younger than you all in high school, could ask him questions. So what we decided to do after the first one, we were pretty excited about this, because presidents didn't do much of that back in those days. We went back to the studio over here. We brought the students back in the studio, and we opened the phones up, and we opened the cameras up, and we went live. We ran the video, recorded video of the president, then had people call in and talk about the experience and ask the young folks what it was like. Well, I don't know how many minutes into the program, up on my screen comes the next call. I mean, we had calls from all over the United States. It said Washington, D.C. And because it was local, in those days you paid a lot of money for long-distance calls, I just let it sit there for a minute, because we had calls coming in from Hawaii and Montana and New York and all that. And finally, up on my screen said, very simply, "Take the call now." And it didn't track for me, and I punched the button up, and I've got the video of this, and I had no idea that my face would ever look this way. But this woman came on with a very stern voice saying, "Mr. Lamb?" And I said, "Yes, one moment for the president." And I had this ridiculous look on my face, like I just swallowed the cat and the bird at the same time. And then we had to wait a few minutes, and all of a sudden he comes on the line. And he said, "I came back to my private quarters here, and I turned you on, and I saw the students talking about the exclusionary rule, and I think they don't have it quite right, and I wanted to set them straight." Well, what I found out later was that because the troika that was around him, and you know some of the people that are, I think in every case, I know in 2 cases, they're alive, Jim Baker and Ed Meese, and then the third one is mine's blank, Mike Deaver. And it turned out that they did not want him to do the show, and they didn't want him to certainly call a call-in show, and he had gone back to the private quarters and had this access, open access, and he calls the operator and says, "Get me on that show." Well, our current chief executive officer, Susan Swain, who was at that time about 27 years old, and she had just come to work for us a year earlier, she's the one that is in the back saying, "Take the call now." I can't tell you about the rest of the stuff. There are people who are still very strongly opposed to television. The former parliamentarian of the House thinks we've done damage, that it's not the House it used to be. Bob Byrd was the one that originally opposed television in the Senate. And believe it or not, I just found out in an interview that I did a couple of days ago that will be on Q&A on Sunday nights at 8 o'clock, something that I never put together. Bob Byrd was opposed to it because of all the things you know about Bob Byrd and the way he revered the United States Senate. The other one in the Senate that was absolutely diametrically opposed to it in a very strong order was Russell Long. And Russell, I did not know this and paying attention to it. I should have, because it's one of the things that's changed in the House and Senate is you have less drinking after hours. There used to be a lot of that going on, and now because when they step up to the microphone, you can tell, and in the early days of C-SPAN, you could tell. But Russell Long had a terrible time with alcohol. He got married, and his wife is the one that got him out of it the last 10 years of his life. But now it looks in retrospect that one of the things he was worried about was if he were a little tipsy on the floor of the Senate, it could be picked up on television. But Bob Byrd went to Russell Long and said, "Russell, it's time. You got to get out of the way. It's a new generation. We got to go on television." It took them 7 years from when we first went on in 1979 with the House to 1986, June 2nd. And the way this happens is always, to me, very strange. Why it happened in the House, why it happened in the Senate, and why it's not happening yet in the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court has the least to lose personally in the sense that they are not up for re-election. But because they have the least to lose personally and they think the most to lose professionally, they don't let cameras in the Supreme Court at this point. But it's a very human thing. And if we ever get in the Supreme Court, the reason will be because a couple of members say, our country doesn't know what we do and how we do it, and it's time that they see what is a fabulous institution, how this thing works. But I didn't really answer your question because I don't like to suggest that we made that big a difference. It's in the eye of the beholder. Next question. Yes, sir. All eyes are on him as he gets the microphone.
Can I ask you to answer the same question you started with, follow the money? What causes 22 cable executives to pony up $60 million a year for C-SPAN?
Well, the way it started was I was working for trade publications in this town called Cablevision Magazine. And I wanted to do, I always thought that we had this juggernaut, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And as good of people as they are, let's not be disparaging. You may not have liked their politics, but they weren't bad people. They were trying to do what they thought was the right thing. But they all did the same thing. Every night they'd run the same stories at the same time on all three networks, and they still do, as a matter of fact. And the only difference is that the ads today, about halfway through, begin to be the medical ads for people my age, and then they get into the feature stories about how our bodies are breaking down and all that. And I know they get furious when they hear this kind of thing, but it's true, and all you have to do is watch it. But I remember I just said, you know, I had a civics class at Lafayette Jefferson High School, and this didn't seem to be the way it should work, and often only one side would be reported on a story and all that stuff. So I just, without money, without any pedigree, without anything, started asking people in the cable industry, can we do something like this? Can we expand the kind of public affairs programming? I always thought that hearings would be the most important thing. And I got about 100 no's because no one could see how this could work. And in 1974, the satellite went up, and I kept asking the question when I was writing for Cablevision magazine, a bit of a conflict, I must say. And one day I was invited, and I was only, I can't remember how old I was, probably about 33 or 34, to a meeting of 40 cable operators at the Mayflower Hotel, where they were inviting people in and asking them to present ideas. At that time in the game, there were only about 3 channels up on the satellite. There are now 500. But at that time, there were only about 3 channels up there. And so they asked me if I'd like to make my pitch. They'd all heard it. They probably got tired of me coming in and tired of me, you know, saying no to me. But they said, come in and make your pitch and see what happens. So I went in on a Saturday, stood up in the room, scared to death, nervous as I could be, made my pitch, thinking that this is going to be another, you know, fruitless opportunity to talk and no one's going to listen. And this is what happened afterwards. Everybody afterwards milling around, 2 men came up to me. And I've always loved this story because one man is bald and Jewish and liberal. The other man is tall, a full head of hair, and a Presbyterian, and a former John Bircher. They were in the same company together. They were very much attracted to one another. One lived in Texas, one lived in Connecticut. And these 2 guys said to me simultaneously, we like your idea, I think we can help you. And that began the process of eventually leading to them giving me $25,000 and saying, take our name and our money and go see if anybody else will pay any attention. And that's exactly what I did. It was kind of a Ponzi scheme. I went from one person to the other. And the biggies in the business, looking for new programming, saw this as a way to do new programming. And they saw it also as a way to do new programming that wasn't expensive, relatively speaking, because at that point it was home box office and Showtime, and they were spending big money for movies and all that stuff. And without going into any more detail on it, which would bore you, that's how it started. I went to 22 different people. They all chipped in something, and that was the little pot of about $480,000 that got us started. And it was for a lot of different reasons. The first reason was, we think we like your idea. The last reason was because the last guy said yes, I'll say yes. And that's the whole story of what I've always said was like the Constitutional Convention. You know, there were 55 delegates, only 39 signed it, 3 were against it, and a bunch of them never showed up. And it was Rhode Island where Ken Masugi started our Tocqueville tour. That was the last one to approve the Constitution. So they're not all going to do exactly what everybody else is going to do. But it's one of those wonderful stories of where private business people decided to do a public service, and that's how it started. It's that simple. Gentleman over here.
Comment and a question. Joe Ryan is my name. That's not the comment. You talked about little people rising to levels of power in this town, and they're mostly the little people who rise to those levels. And you mentioned arrogance, and just the comment I would like to make, particularly because there are so many young people here, is just remember that your behavior is rewarded by who returns your phone calls after you're out of office. The other question, the question I have, you asked of the folks, but what's your take on Snowden?
I'm going to not answer that. I've tried very hard in my time at C-SPAN not to get in the middle of these controversies because my opinion isn't any better than anybody else's, and I will just say this much. I don't really know what I think right now. I find this to be very, very confusing. And it's not just that, it's everything that's going on in town. I did think this president was going to be transparent. He's told an awful lot of people when he ran that all the healthcare negotiations were going to be on C-SPAN. I thought it was always very interesting because he never asked if they could go on C-SPAN, and we are private. We do not march to the government's tune. We don't march away from it either, but we don't march to their tune. And when time came, there were no negotiations televised by us. There was one that didn't matter in the White House at one point, which was a show. There was one that happened in the Blair House, which we televised. But I will say this about the other part of your comment. I can remember, you know, I'm no longer the chief executive officer. A lot of people thought I had power when I was chief executive officer. They didn't understand that I didn't, and I didn't make decisions on programming, and I kept telling them that, but they kept calling my desk, and I made a lot of people mad because I wouldn't take their calls. But I will remember one very well-known television correspondent who had been retired from his network. You notice how I said that. He had been retired from his network. And he called me one day and said, and he actually was from my state of Indiana, and he said, and I had no relationship with him whatsoever. He was on the other end of the phone. He was very chummy. This was about 10 years ago. And he said, you know, I'd just love to get together with you and have lunch. Well, I knew there was no way that he wanted to chum with me at lunch. It just wasn't. And I said, by the way, so-and-so, I just want you to know, in case you were thinking about this, that we don't have any jobs for people that were in network news. I mean, we're trying very hard not to have a pedigree at all, but I said, we just don't have any. I mean, we don't pay that kind of money, and we're not. And I said, but I'd like to have lunch with you anyway. And he said, well, I tell you what, I think I'll pass on that. So I've had enough of that happen in this town that, you know, I'm ready for it. I expect it. I have no expectations anymore on almost anything. But I'm sorry to dodge the Snowden thing. It's fascinating. And actually, I'd love to know what some of these folks think, because it's going to be your world that this kind of stuff happens more and more. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes, thank you. My name is Maury Nunes. I'm not one of the students, but I have taught here in Washington for about the last 20 years. That's good to hear. I'm in my 60s, actually, about your age.
Wow.
But my question is this. If I recall correctly, the headline for today's event was political power in the media. And the message that I'm getting from your presentation here today, which is also very entertaining, of course, but the message I'm getting is that political power is primarily about the money. Have I misunderstood you?
Yes and no. Understanding what happens, you must think about where the money comes from. And I've learned that just by living it all the time. And we have a very good funding base and has been that way. But I have to tell you, we're totally dependent for our future on the cable television executives. Totally. And that's one of the reasons that we've kept the price of this service down, way, way down. I think, though, that political power today is no longer in the hands of the few organizations it was in when I first got here. And I think that's very healthy. I am one of those that listens to talk radio night and day. Believe me, night and day. I am one of those that loves every newspaper I can find on the streets. I was disappointed that the Examiner went out of business because I love print. I'm old-fashioned as all get out. I think that today anybody that wants to get their message out has a place to do it. One of the quietly hugely successful things that's happened in my lifetime is the Drudge Report, which, by the way, drives people in the old-timers in my business nuts. They can't believe, and for all the reasons you would expect, and I don't want to be critical of them so much, is it just drives them crazy that he's been as successful as he's been. I think political power today has been dispersed. There are still pockets that have a tremendous amount of power, but the best thing that we have going for us as a country, in my opinion, is the checks and balances. Or are the checks and balances. I mean, if we didn't have the checks and balances, we would be toast. Because the more power people get, the more they want, and the more they get, the more often restrictive they are, the more they want to do things that they never would do if they were out of power. I always love it when I meet somebody who has been a United States Senator or a cabinet officer or at the White House who begins to badmouth the system after they've gotten out. And it always amazes me as I want to say to them, why didn't you do something when you were there? Well, it was too much fun when I was there. So the money thing to me is the first place I go. on almost everything. Where's the money come from? Then you can better understand. I don't care whether it's Hillsdale, C-SPAN, or the Washington Post. You can understand why they do what they do.
We have time for one more question.
Oh. Let's take two very quickly because there were two hands up.
Okay, why do you suppose that the media hasn't done anything like to hold up people's feet to the fire about responding to the situations in Benghazi and on various issues and scandals? And like they would have 30 or 40 years ago, I think it would have not. I don't believe it would have been let off the hook so quickly.
I don't know that. I know that we've gotten a lot on Benghazi, and I would just say this to you, and I don't want to go any farther than this, that you've got far more on Benghazi because of the media structure now than you would have when I first came to town. That would have been an easy one just to move aside. If the mainstream didn't want to talk about it, it was over. And so this goes for both sides. I'm someone who watches Rachel Maddow at night and watches Bill O'Reilly, and I watch what's going on with both sides, and I really like the fact that both of them are there. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Yes, Mr. Lamb. My name is Bill Janis, and I saw your interview with Patrick Gavin of Politico, and the thought just occurred to me, do you believe that technology is helping to disperse political power? Because I mean, I watched you guys for, a good 45 minutes, and he provided numerous examples of things of which I hadn't been aware, and technology just mushrooming in terms of getting out an individual's political message.
Absolutely. Technology is everything, and you go back to the reason why we exist, it's because of the satellite and the cable industry. And as soon as there was a low-cost delivery system, which was the satellite, we were able to get into business. The best way to describe that is if I had wanted to help start C-SPAN before the satellite, it would have probably cost me $15 million to get to all these communities because I'd have to go to AT&T. I had one source, that was it, period. And when I started with C-SPAN, it cost us $100 an hour. Think about that, because of the satellite. It was impossible to dream about doing things that were unique to a small audience. YouTube today is amazing, what the power of YouTube. The fact that I stand here after our archive and have 200,000 hours of history that is available free of charge is mind-boggling. And frankly, we did it because of a very smart guy named Robert Browning, who's a professor at Purdue. He's the one that built it. It belongs to C-SPAN, but it doesn't cost us that much to maintain. And it's an amazing thing. So it's all about technology because the American people are incredibly creative. People around the world are creative. Now that we have these different places to go, you see the kind of stuff that we saw on that program. In fairness to Patrick Gavin of Politico, who was a great guest, those are our decisions to put those videos on there and have him explain how they fit into the system. But I want to do some more of that because there is so much going on that we don't know about that it's worth doing. One more quickly. I know you're in a hurry. This gentleman had his hand up. Go ahead and right there in the blue shirt, and I'll shut her down.
Yeah, I just wondered, we've heard a lot with all the NSA stuff and some of the other stories about ranking this president. He came in saying he'd be the most transparent in history, and now people want to talk about going the other way. You'll have some kind of extreme comments. You've been here since before Nixon. When you're looking at him against his own promises and against the track record of his predecessors, what do you think of how he's done on that front?
They've all done the same thing. I stood around Lyndon Johnson for 2 years as a naval aide. The most magnificent experience you could ever imagine. I mean, you talk about, and then having the ability years later to start putting on the telephone conversations in the Oval Office on a C-SPAN radio station, which we've done for years, was just unbelievable. Because I would be standing next to him the same day that some of these recordings were being made in the Oval Office and have no idea. But all presidents promise things they don't deliver on. A lot of them don't promise things they do deliver on. And it's all a matter of where your emotions are. I would just say to anybody, any issue that comes up, approach it on a zero-based analysis. Ask yourself, if George W. Bush was president, would you like what the NSA is doing? And if you conclude yes, then you better rethink it, because and if you say that you're nervous as heck because Obama is now getting to do that, I mean, the fact is one person doesn't make that big a difference in that system. Those federal employees are out there all the time. They aren't going anywhere. And they can, they can look in on this stuff at all times. I'm a privacy person. That's why I don't tweet. That's why I don't Facebook. That's why I don't send many emails. That's why I don't instant message or text. I don't really want to be followed. I'm not paranoid. I just soon people not know what I'm doing. I'm not doing anything wrong. Ever since I got married 8 years ago, I've been behaving very, very well. Thank you all very much.